of your hands. You've done all you can do. You've given God the problem. It's no longer up to you. You prayed the prayer of faith. You're standing on God's truth. While you're waiting on the answer, He has a question for you. Is anything too hard for God? Who's got a problem beyond His power to solve? Are there situations He's not the master of? Is anything too hard for God? Only we believe, trust His word, you'll see. His plans are now unfolding, performing perfectly. It's clear how much He loves you. Just look at all He's done. For all your questions, there's really only one. Is anything too hard for God? Who's got a problem beyond His power to solve? Are there situations He's not the master of? Is anything too hard for God? Are there situations He's not the master of? Is anything too hard for God?
So let's continue to do that. Let me share with you just a couple verses before we, and I really mean just a couple. We talked about in 2 Kings chapter 5, we talked about Naaman, and it's such a, to me, it's such a beautiful passage, and that little girl, Gary, to me speaks so much, and how she changed so many things. And we see Naaman's conversion. We see that he worshiped the Lord, and as he left, he asked that he says that I might be given 2 mules burden of earth. He wanted to take dirt with him from Israel so that he could pour out on the ground, and it would be like, and what he was going to do, he would pour that out on the ground, and then he would build his altar and he would sacrifice to the Lord. And it was dirt of Israel. And he said, hey, I want to do that. And he goes on to ask Elisha, he said, look, when I go into with my master, he says he worships, he said, the house of Rimmon, R-I-M-M-O-N, verse 18. He says, I'm going to have to go in there with him because I don't have the opportunity to refuse. And he says, and when I bow myself to them, I hope that the Lord will pardon thy servant in this thing. Now, Elisha didn't say one way or another about it. He just said, go in peace. And it says, so he departed. But the part that speaks to me in that particular verse is he was under conviction about that. So Lord changed his heart. He says, boy, in verse 18, he says, if my Lord goes in, I hope God will pardon me when I stand in there while he worships. He said, I'm not going to worship, but when he does, I hope the Lord will pardon thy servant in this thing. So we could say, well, he ought to know better than doing that. Well, he didn't have a choice. He's actually under the rule of the king. But he was under conviction about that, which showed me that, of course, he was saved. The other things were there as well that say he was saved. But now he's showing that there's conviction, and he's thinking ahead. Elijah didn't answer him. Elisha never did give this man much, and I think it was because he wanted to make sure that the pride was out of the way there. And I think we can, Scripture tells us that the other sins, the lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, come from the pride of life. I can relate to Naaman. I'm just that way. I was in the army. I was in a position where if I say, I'd like Keith to have been there, because soldier, give me 100 push-ups and don't open your mouth. Do it. He had to do that, and I didn't do that to people, but when I didn't have to convince anyone to do anything. I would say, do this, and let me know when it's done. And that's the end of the story. He didn't have any choice. He just do it. And so I relate to him, and it's easy to get in a position to where those people should get out of your way on the road. I'm the same way, Beverly. I don't want to get, and pride for me has a way of sneaking in there. And so I think from that comes the other sins. We have to be real careful about that. Further, we see at the end of that chapter, the rest of the story it talks about Gehazi, which was Elisha's servant. You realize that Elisha was Elijah's right hand, or Elijah's servant, and you realize that Elisha took the place of Elijah, and the Lord gave him, as he requested, a double portion. He does a whole lot more than Elijah did. And so Elisha's servant was Gehazi, and Gehazi was the person who Elisha was molding to take his place. And so that was what his future was going to be. But we see what happens in Gehazi's life. Verse 20 says that Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, and so we know that that's who he worked with. Well, what happened in his life was, you remember, as Naaman had offered Elijah, hey, let me pay you for what you have done. And Elijah says, as the Lord liveth, I will receive none of it. And the guy urged him to take it. He says, no, I will not take it. I'm not going to take it. No, Elisha strictly refused it. And the reason, you say, well, he could have took it. He could have done so much good. He could have gave it to the poor. He could have took care of widows. Elisha wanted to make clear to Naaman that the gift of God was not something you could buy. That what God gave was not for purchase. It wasn't for money. That it was through the grace of God. And so chapter 5 down to that point is to show God's mercy and God's grace. And so Elisha, one of the reasons that he didn't come out and meet him was not to be strictly obstinate, not just to help him deal with his pride, but so that there was no works involved, that it had to be strictly the work of Jesus Christ, and that it had to be free, and it had to picture grace. And that's what this whole thing is a picture of grace that we see down to verse 19. That's what it was, a picture of God's grace. And that's what Elisha was wanting to show. That's what God had led him to do. But we see Gehazi had misinterpreted things, and he looked at things a little differently, because he decided in his heart, he says, when Nahum leaves, Gehazi says, I hate to see all that money go to waste. He says, I'm going to run and go after him, and I'm going to get some of that. He offered it to us, so we need to take it. And the Scripture says that he ran after him, and when Naaman saw him running, that he stopped. He got down from his chair. He says, hey, is everything okay? And Gehazi says, yes, everything is fine. He says, all is well. My master hath sent me. So he lied. He opened his mouth, and out it came. So in verse 20, he had his heart, he had coveted in his heart, and it manifests. And right now he starts out, and it's a lie, because Elisha didn't send him to that. He says, he tells him in verse 20, he says, my master sent me. And he says, there's some prophets coming, and there was. And the young men of these prophets, he says, how about I take a talent of silver and a couple changes of garments? So I shared with you this morning, a talent is about $1,940 worth. And he says, hey, how about I do that? So, I'll take this so that we can take care of these sons of the prophets. And Naaman said, well, sure, but just take 2 of them instead. And he says he urged him, and actually he bound up 2 bags, and so he sent him 2 talents of silver, so it'd be about $3,000. And he says, here, take that. And then he gave him some silver. And he says, take extra clothes. And that's what he gave him. And so he gave all these things to Gehazi. And Gehazi took it. And he took it. And he stored them in his house. And he let the men go. And then what we see happen is, this guy, he's just... he's been working with Elijah. He saw Elijah go tell the king of Israel that, hey, O king, that the folks from Samaria are camped, or are going to camp right down in this area, so stay away from it. Don't go that way. Well, Elisha wasn't anywhere where anybody told him that. The king, when he got his army ready and said, go down there, it was in just their meeting. Elisha was nowhere around. The Lord told Elisha this was what was going to happen, and Elisha told the king. So the Lord was speaking to Elisha on a daily basis, hourly sometimes, because of his walk that he had with him. And the Lord had already told Elisha what Gehazi had done. And when he came back after burying all that stuff, or hiding it in his house, he asked Gehazi, he says, hey, where'd you go? And Elijah says, or Gehazi said, nowhere. I hadn't been anywhere. I've just been hanging around the house, waiting for the sons of the prophets to come, deep in prayer or something. Because Elijah says, where'd you go? Where comes thou? Oh, hadn't been anywhere. And then Elijah says, and he said unto him, verse 26, went not mine heart with thee when the man turned again from his chariot to meet thee? Is it a time to receive money and to receive garments and olive yards and vineyards and sheep and oxen and men servants and maid servants? Elisha says, hey, he says, did my heart go with you when you went? He didn't. He'd already asked him once, and says, hey, I didn't go anywhere. I've been right here. And Elisha confronts him with what he had done, and there was no denying it then. And at this time, Gehazi has to realize, I have just lost my position. I'm no longer going to be used. I'm no longer going to take the place of Elijah. Look how I have failed. And verse 27 puts it in perspective. It says, here's what he says to him. He says, the leprosy, therefore, of Naaman shall cleave unto thee, and unto thy seed forever. And he went out from his presence a leper, white as snow. For as quickly as Naaman's leprosy was cured, as quickly as he was saved, so did Gehazi, the servant of Elisha, get leprosy. And Elisha says that it's going to be on your seed forever. What a pronouncement that it was. How we see early in chapter 5 of God's grace. And at the end of chapter 5, with this, we see the cost of sin and the cost of disobedience. The guy Naaman had offered it. There wasn't anything they could have taken. They could have taken the money. There wasn't any problem with any of that. But now he had left the idea to Naaman that, hey, maybe God's grace can be purchased. He had destroyed some of the things that Elisha had tried to do and that the Lord wanted him to do. And from now on, Gehazi's seed were going to be lepers. And so their life, the consequences of sin, that we see that is passed on and on and on and on because of that one sin. It gives a whole new picture to the sins of the father is visited on the sons, and how the actions of me, how it's going to go for my children and their children and their children. And you think about, I was the oldest of the siblings. Matter of fact, when Chris and Scotty introduced me, they say, "Hey, this is my dad," and so I really appreciate it when they do that. And but I started out in 1979 and was the youngest person ever hired in Greenberg County for the Sheriff's Department. And now you see, they're law officers. I went in the Army. You see, both of them have went in the Army. I'm hoping now they both become preachers, but I don't know if that's what happened. They'll just tell me what to do. But the influence you have on those that come behind you, and so Gehazi's influence that he was going to have on his family has just changed from the person who was going to replace Elisha to the person who has leprosy because he failed, because he lied to the Lord, he lied to Elisha, and now he has to deal with leprosy the rest of his life. But you know, I wrote when I was studying that, I thought, well, do we ever see that name anymore in Scripture? Is he ever around anymore? Sure enough, and in chapter 8, he's there. He's still doing. He's still working. He's still doing what he's supposed to. He's just doing it now as a leper. And he's paying his price. Well, I'm sure glad that when I see him, that there's not somebody around and say, well, because you did that, now you're a leper from now on. But we see the picture of grace, and then we see the picture of disobedience, all in that same chapter. And it sure gives you a lot to think about all the way around. But we serve a gracious God, marvelous grace, wonderful grace.